Hello. Apologies for the technical glitch there. Welcome everyone to our special SIG event today. Thank you for coming, and I can see there are quite a few of you, so thank you very much for your time. My name is Fado Govaerts, and I am one of the three conveners for this special interest group, Alternative Education at BERA. I'm based at the University of Bath, and I am a long-term home educator of 5 children, and have used alternative provisions within the home education context quite frequently. And I run several ones myself in terms of Lego and other forest school and other clubs. We have also Amber with us, who some of you may know. Amber is a lecturer in childhood and youth studies at the Open University. And we'll also have some exciting news to share with you in our SIG. We have a very new convener with us today. Dr. Stefania Romano is literally just a week since he's been a convener. So very welcome from myself and from Amber to Stefania. And would you like to introduce yourself, Stefania?
Yes, hello everybody, good afternoon. Thank you, Fado, to introduce me. I'm really excited to be with you. I'm Stefania Romano. I'm based at the University of Leeds, and my expertise are in creativity and entrepreneurship education. And I've always been interested in alternative educations with my students at undergraduate and postgraduate level. As Fado said, I just arrived, so everything is new to me, and I'm looking forward to be part of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. We look very much forward working with you as well. And we also look very much forward to bringing our SIG members more exciting events and collaboration opportunities. Of course, as all of you know, our SIG focuses on alternative provisions, which are alternative to school provisions, and education provisions can take place anywhere really, from library to forest schools. And we hope to promote a network of practitioners and researchers in this field and give a voice to those who work in these settings, but also who receive it. One of these examples of alternative provisions will be given today by our keynote speaker, Dr. Andy Malcolm from the University of Bedfordshire. His presentation will be about sustaining post-16 destinations from alternative provision. And the study, it's a very interesting study that explores which practices in alternative provision successfully make a transition post-16 into further education, training and employment. We hope that this will trigger a conversation into post-pandemic transitions for AP as well. Please do use the chat function to ask any questions. We will look at it, and we will ask Andy the questions after his presentation. Any comments, of course, are welcome as well. I can actually see what you're seeing, but I can access the questions through Slido. What else do I need to say? That's all the admin part done. Yes, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and at the end we'll open the discussion. Thank you very much, Andy, for your patience in planning this event with us, and also thank you for your time today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Andy Malcolm.
Super. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Could we go to my first slide? Super. So yeah, as Fadua kind of set out, this research study I undertook was very much looking at seeking to explore what helps young people who attend alternative provision settings transition into stable post-16 education or employment settings. So stability, I usually start this slide by talking about what some of those definitions are. So I usually talk about what stability means. So stability is from the government data that is published by the DfE on an annual basis about students who, as they move on from Key Stage 4 into Key Stage 5, have what's viewed as a stable placement, which is a placement that has been stable for 2 terms after transition. And then education or employment, yeah, includes training, includes apprenticeship. So it's anything that is what we called an official placement, I suppose, that includes all types of education, training or employment. I think it's also worth noting that my interest in alternative provision, and I think that the remit of this group is slightly wider in terms of alternative education, a bit more broadly. So just to be explicit, to me, my specific area of interest is alternative provision, and alternative provision denotes what I suppose is in line with the government definition of alternative provision. So schools that exist for pupils who've been excluded or directed there by their head teacher. So it includes pupil referral units, includes alternative provision free schools and alternative provision academies. And then there is a whole raft of other alternative provision in terms of smaller settings that might be independent schools or unregistered provision that will exist in local areas. Sometimes there's quite a number of those types of settings, and a number more official pupil referral units or alternative provision free schools and the like, but usually probably on a smaller scale. I suppose this research in particular, the data that was available that I analysed as the kind of starting point for this study was focused in on alternative provision free schools, alternative provision academies and pupil referral units. Next slide. So when I started with that, so just a bit of an opportunity. I don't know whether this slide will, I won't be able to see this if I don't stay on this slide for a moment. So let me pause and give you a chance to try and get into Slido and answer this question, just so I have a bit of an understanding of who's here. That's probably quite helpful. I think there are about 20 or 30 people attending, so I can see that 3 people have answered so far. The percentages tell me 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 maybe. Okay, so quite I'm going to assume that is probably the level of response we might get. Okay, so maybe a few more people who research, but then also some people who work in alternative provision and other professional interests in alternative provision. Cool. I suppose I can't be sure whether people are using the definition of alternative education when responding to these questions, or alternative provision as I've set out, which is probably a bit narrower, but that's helpful to have a bit of an understanding of who's here. So thank you for responding to that. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said, I started with this data set that is published on an annual basis by the Department for Education. So I looked at the 2016 data to begin with, and this shows that for all alternative provision settings, 56% of young people from those settings maintain a stable placement, remembering that definition of 2 terms of stability in terms of what they've moved on to in their post-16 setting. 56% versus 94% of students from mainstream schools. So there's really quite a dramatic difference there. And anyone who's worked in or researched alternative provision settings as I've defined them will understand that yes, there is a marked difference between the pupils in those settings and their life experiences. And to some extent that's unsurprising. But what was really interesting to me when looking at this data was that actually because it's broken down right to the institutional level, when you look at individual institutions, the level of successful outcomes, the rates of successful outcomes for students from those institutions range from 23% right up to 85% in terms of the proportion of students having a stable placement as they move on. Now, those cohorts are quite small, so percentages can change quite rapidly when just one student has a different outcome. But I did also look at preceding years and following years data to check whether the institutions that I was looking at had a level of stability in terms of those kind of levels of outcomes, and the full details are in the study that's been published, but yes is the broad out answer to that question. So what I set out to do after kind of noting this in the data was to explore which practices in these AP settings in England made a difference. So I did this I used an FOI a freedom of information request to 174 institutions, 85 of which responded. And then I supplemented this with 9 interviews with heads from some of the low performing, some of those settings with kind of mid-range performance, and then some of those settings with really high rates of performance in terms of sustained post-16 destinations. So there are some real strengths, I think, to this design in terms of it's really quite large scale in terms of being based on the outcomes from, you know, the entire cohort of entire population essentially of AP settings, if we are just focused in on pupil referral units, AP free schools and AP academies. But there are limitations as well. So it was retrospective. So I was asking staff members about the practice that had been in place, you know, 2 or 3 years ago by the time I was interviewing them. Some staff had moved and practice had changed and, you know, memory fades. But there are some real strengths to this study and this design, I believe. If we could go to the next slide. So the big picture in terms of what I found out and what I'm going to kind of talk to today were that there were 3 specific practices which seemed to be connected to rates of sustained destinations being higher. And then it also seemed to be important how staff viewed what they were doing in alternative provision and viewed alternative provision more generally. That seemed to come through in the data and wasn't something that I was necessarily expecting. That's always interesting when you get a finding that's not something you were, you know, anticipating, wasn't something that was identified in the existing literature particularly. And then also the awareness of staff, and perhaps in particular those leading alternative provision settings, of the broader context within which they worked also seemed to be important. So I'm going to talk to all of those things in a little bit more detail before we kind of open up to questions. So if we go to the next slide, the first practice, effective and ongoing tracking of students who had left their provision. So all of the interviewees, somewhat unsurprisingly, given the focus of the research I was undertaking, discussed tracking. However, there did seem to be some differences. So all of those interviewees from high performing settings talked about active and ongoing tracking, or tracking for a set amount of time. So a couple of them talked about tracking for a year, one for 3 years, and one talked about a very active and ongoing approach without talking about a specific length of time. And the contrast of that with the lower and mid-performing settings seemed to be that they were talking about lacking data, lacking support, lacking time, and sometimes it being the responsibility of an external organisation or the local authority. This tracking was viewed as not necessarily their responsibility. A few quotes to kind of highlight that, things that stuck in my mind. You know, we always, as a researcher, there are always the occasional phrase that sticks in your mind when you do a bit of research. So some of the interviewees from these perhaps lower performing settings said things like, obviously we've got new students coming through, or that's work we can't do, or your priorities change quite naturally. So this kind of feeling that actually there isn't data, there isn't support, there isn't time to be able to do this. And actually these findings from the interviews were backed up by the freedom of information request responses. So those in the upper quartile in terms of sustained destinations, of those, nearly 70% agreed with the data that the DFE produced, whereas only 30% of those in the lowest quartile of performance agreed with the data produced by the DFE. So the data produced by the DFE is based on, you know, capturing data from sixth form colleges and other colleges and the various places it needs to be captured from to be able to have quite a robust data set. So that high performing institutions agreed with the fairly reliable data set from the DFE at quite a significantly high level, so 70% versus 30%, when you compare to the lower quartile of performance in terms of institutions, suggests to me that they are more active, have a better idea of where their students have actually gone on to. And some of this might have been about definitions. So some of the commentary that you often get back alongside a freedom of information request, some of the commentary from lower performing institutions suggested that they were defining this as, well, they had a placement. I knew they were going to college, and the number that I knew were going to college isn't the same as the number that the DFE says had a stable placement. But that's a difference of definition, because that's having a placement versus having a sustained destination. But yeah, interesting that higher performing settings, both in interviews and in terms of the FOI, seem to be more effective in their tracking of students as they moved on. So that was the first practice. Let's move to the next slide. The second practice, can we go back one? We're on practice 3. Can we go back? Yeah, but thank you. So practice 2, the second thing that seemed to come through in the interviews was a high quality core academic offer. This was prominent in high performing settings. So all the high performing interviewees conveyed really quite a strong focus on GCSE qualifications. And this wasn't necessarily, it could be viewed as being in tension with vocational provision, but it wasn't, because one of the high performing AP heads had students in for 1 or 2 days a week doing their English and maths GCSEs and a science BTEC. And if they weren't able to work at GCSE, they were at least doing functional skills. And the rest of the time they were off site in vocational provision with staff from the setting going out and supporting them in those places. I think this is, you know, an interesting and probably important finding, but it's also important to caveat here that some AP settings within localities are viewed as the setting for higher achieving pupils, the setting for pupils who need a more vocational offer. And perhaps that is a bit of a dualism and needs breaking down a bit. But I think in some of the interviewees, in some of the kind of side conversations or the discussion more generally, it did come through that there were at times settings that interviewees knew of or had worked in previously where, you know, that was the setting where anyone who was viewed as capable of doing their GCSEs would go to. And this is the setting where students who are not in that position would end up attending. They would do a more vocational offer. I think actually the settings where a high quality core academic offer was in place wouldn't necessarily be in that situation where they were just getting the students who were more academically able. They were kind of for everyone, and some of the interviewees talked explicitly about having students who, you know, just failed or been failed again and again and again, and actually then came to them and were able to, you know, make academic progress. And I think actually maybe that's a bit of a dualism within AP that needs breaking down and thinking about a bit more critically. Let's go to the next slide. So the third practice was opportunities for students to take measured steps, well-measured steps into independence outside of their main placement. So this could involve the provision of pre-16 units or even courses within post-16 settings, particularly those that students might go on to transition to. And there's a bit of similarity here to the potential for post-16 AP being a question that's muted around this kind of area of study. Like, do we need settings for students who attend AP to be providing a post-16 offer? I think in my instinct, having done this research and more generally, I suppose, is that post-16 AP is not going to be a panacea. The thing that seemed to be working from what some of the interviewees said was where it's right and appropriate, we might have a post-16 pupil, but we would probably have that as a dual placement so that they could attend us part of the time and be in college part of the time. And actually, I think in its own right, just having post-16 AP probably isn't going to be the solution in my mind, having done this research. But yeah, the provision of pre-16 units or courses in post-16 settings so students can go and get used to those settings, particularly if they're going to be likely to transition there, seemed really useful. The use of vocational placements and work experience seemed helpful for, you know, getting experience in other settings outside of the, you know, supportive context of alternative provision. And actually the actual practical exercise of getting there, so learning to travel independently, seemed to be an opportunity for students, as one interviewee said, to learn to manage themselves. So that process of merely getting to a setting outside of the alternative provision setting, where it's maybe less of that supportive environment, less of that kind of safety that students maybe have come to rely on or come to value from being in an AP setting, actually learning to step outside of that in a safe and measured way seemed to be quite important. So those were the three practices. And then if we go to the next slide, there seem to be a couple of things that related to staff more generally. So there actually seemed to be an opportunity, and this was one of the things that I wasn't expecting. It's a bit of a surprise in doing the research and doing and analysis. It wasn't something that came through when I was doing the interviews. It was in doing the analysis and getting really into the data that I noticed it. But there seemed to be an opportunity to reorientate staff views from viewing AP as not the real world towards seeing greater potential in their students and developing a belief that with encouragement, support, that students can change. And I think this relates to a belief. There was kind of discussion in the existing research that I reviewed for preparing for this study, that the levels of support in alternative provision differ so dramatically with those levels of support in FE settings that this can limit students' ability to transition. Now, there's definitely truth in that, but I guess in the words of one of the high-performing interviewees, that it is a challenge, but we seek to loosen the apron strings. Sometimes an interviewee coins a phrase that just sticks in your head, as I've said already, but this interviewee talked about, we seek to loosen the apron strings. It just felt like a nice metaphor for, we provide that support, but we also want to encourage students and allow them to have opportunities to explore and become more independent, I suppose. And yeah, that view of AP is not the real world. It was one of those things that came through quite strikingly in the language of some of the lower performing AP settings and those interviewed from those settings. So two interviewees used almost exactly the same language of AP is not the real world. Whereas, that some of the interviewees from high performing settings said things like students' behavior changes so much that they change as people. They talked about being conscious not to wrap them up in cotton wool too much, to create an environment where they can thrive and are happy. And then once they're in an environment where students are thriving and are happy, they keep pushing the boundaries. So it's that safety, but then it's also that instinct to push out, to loosen those apron strings, I suppose. And I think there's a real role for leaders in alternative provision settings to set a staff culture that kind of underpins this belief and supports staff in working in this, emotionally challenging context, but to retain a belief in hope, essentially, in hope that students in these settings with encouragement and support can have positive outcomes. That seem to actually be quite important findings. So the final area of findings I want to talk about before we get to any questions is that actually those working in alternative provision settings, and this came through in the interviews in particular, have really quite a unique perspective. And I would even go as far as to try to argue perhaps the best perspective in terms of the view of the local system providing for children and young people on the margins of mainstream society. It will be those children and young people who attend alternative provision free schools, alternative provision academies, and people referral units. And actually, it struck me in doing this research that local leaders should be seeking the perspective of those working in the AP sector and empowering them to shape and strengthen local service provision for children and young people who attend these kind of settings, and actually, probably indirectly, if you do that, children and young people who are marginalised from society more generally and of this kind of age group. So high-performing interviewees quite frequently talked about direct involvement in the local system, whereas for mid-performing and lower-performing interviewees, they kind of only talked about careers in this way, and that tended to be in terms of local authority services or local careers networks that they were a part of. So there was maybe a level of connection to a locality-based offer, but high-performing interviewees tend to be actively engaging in the system at a local level. So they talked about system-wide issues. One of them referred to not being a pupil referral unit, but a pupil referral service. Talked about engaging with schools and other practitioners around referrals and dealing with inconsistencies and thresholds. Talked about elective home education, the prominence of SEN, approaches that they were aware of in other local authorities, which they believed were masking the actual rates of permanent exclusion. So one of them talked about being an Ofsted inspector. They talked about in-year for access panels, being members of safeguarding boards, just a general either involvement in the local system or appreciation of some of the dynamics around alternative provision more generally. So that kind of more systemic perspective seemed to be maybe slightly more hardwired into some of the high-performing areas. So there seem to be those three practices of effectively tracking pupils as they move on from alternative provision settings, a high-quality core academic offer, and opportunities for students to take well-measured steps, supported steps outside of alternative provision settings. And then a real opportunity around reorienting staff views away from seeing alternative provision as a setting which is not like the real world, where actually it's so different to FE or any other kind of setting that you might transition onto that we know pupils are going to struggle, to actually viewing it as no, actually we can have hope. We can believe that with our support, with the changes that we see in AP setting, we can see students succeeding as they move beyond here. And then actually the role for AP leaders in particular to play an active and important part in shaping local service provision for these young people, but also young people in similar situations to those who end up attending alternative provision settings, whether that's people referral units or some of the other settings that are available. So if we go to my next slide, it's just kind of a little kind of poster that I worked up with key findings and just an opportunity to put any questions in. I think, Badua, you're going to come back in at this point.
Yes. Thank you, Andy. Thank you. That was really interesting. Just out of personal interest, really, from my research is related to it, and I've got well, I've got one research paper that's related to it, to the GCSEs in alternative provision. But one thing that just intrigued me when you said that two of your interviewees said it's not the real world. What do you think they think is the real world? Did they explain at all? Did they elaborate?
It's quite a while since I did the research, so I've not got, the transcript from that section of the interview in my head. My instinct, and I guess my kind of impression from memory, is that it was around the level of support that we provide in an AP setting. This will be a staff member speaking. The level of support we provide, the kind of the level of acceptance that we can have of a young person when their behaviour is challenging is not the same as that which is going to be the case in an FE setting or in a workplace. I think that's my instinct on what this kind of setting is not the real world. Okay. Which is interesting because it suggests that those AP settings experience maybe quite a high degree of challenging behaviour still. And I guess I say still because, I don't know whether we have a few people who work in AP here. I worked in AP before doing a professional doctorate and becoming an academic. And actually, we did have challenging behaviour, but frequently the referral and the kind of outline of the student that we got from the mainstream school who was referring to us and the student who turned up didn't really match up because it was contextual. Basically, I'll summarise it. Once a student's in a very different environment where there's space and people who listen and a much higher staff-student ratio and pretty caring and holding environment, like behaviour changes, or it seemed to anyway. So I think that's kind of.
Thank you. So in that time, and also during the presentation, we've had a few questions. We've had a comment from Christine Dennell. She indeed currently runs a AP post-16 provision, and she just commented and said they do receive applications from counties as there are so few of these. So they keep moving according to how many votes they get. I'm just trying to look at the minutes, see which ones were asked first. We have a question from Stephanie King. She asks you, Andy, do you think the nature of the intake of the units influences the outcome? E.g., a provision may target young people for their interest in academic and vocational skills.
Yeah, I think there will be an extent to which that is true, or that potentially will, if a setting is viewed in the local area as the place for students who don't attend school, perhaps because of being signed off from school by CAMH, but they're academically able, and we know this provision is viewed as a safe space, which is going to be supportive. Like, the outcomes from that setting are going to be very different to the outcomes from perhaps another setting. So I think, of course, but I also think that doesn't undermine the validity of the findings that I've presented today. I think as anyone working in alternative provision, I think you need to reflect on your intake and the kind of provision that you're providing, the groups that you're working with. But the interviewees who were from high performing settings definitely weren't all working just with those who were more academically able. It seemed to very much be stuff about the provision that was making at least some of that difference. And, you know, cohort to cohort will vary, but I also tried to account for that by, you know, looking at 5 years of data for all of the settings that I'd done interviews with, to check that they, and the detail of this is in the publication, but to check that they were kind of broadly in line with upper quartile or lower quartile or middle performance, and they tended to be.
Excellent. A question from Dr. Sharon Smith. Do you think the definition of AP reflects where we are now? AP is also supported by other providers, online education, virtual schools. Any views of this? And, you know, when I started, you know, opening this event, I did mention there were some examples, but she's right, isn't it? I mean, the definitions for AP are quite wide, and this is just one of them. What are your thoughts on this? How do you think the definition of AP that's provided by the Department of Education reflects where we are now at the moment?
I think there is obviously a wide range of education and provision that goes on outside of mainstream school settings, and I guess home education, and there are settings which home educators draw on, and then there are independent schools that so there are some independent schools that I would count as alternative provision because of how they view themselves as the kind of pupils that they cater for, and how the local authority would have a relationship and schools would have a relationship with them. It's the same potential pupil group that would also end up and be referred to or placed in a pupil referral unit, alternative provision free school, or alternative provision academy. And I think that is my specific area of interest. And I actually think the government definition is fairly specific for that area of the education system. But then there is this other complexity. And then I'm aware also, you know, that there is at times pressure in the SEN system in a local area, and that can lead to, you know, pupils being in AP who might otherwise be in an SEN school setting. So there are very much definitional difficulties around alternative provision. I personally, because it's my specific area of interest, I think the specific definition of alternative provision that the DFE use is quite close to what I would consider as alternative provision. And I think I would use the phrase alternative education to view the other stuff that we've kind of talked about, probably. And I think I would almost say actually those are two separate things, and then there's obviously some blurriness, but I would actually say, you know, home education, some of the independent settings that aren't mainstream schools that support some of that stuff is alternative education. This is just my view. And then alternative provision is pupil referral units and AP academies, AP free schools, and some of the independent provisions specifically geared up for that area of the education system. But I know others would disagree, but that's kind of how it fits most neatly in my head, I suppose.
I think Amber just put her hand up. She put something in chat. Do you think you can unmute, Amber? Do you wanna?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Apologies, I'm not on camera. Thank you so much, Andy, for a really fascinating and interesting presentation. I just had a couple of questions. So the title of this event is Post-Pandemic, and thinking about how some of the nuances and points of tension and interesting observations that you've already made around the kind of dualism of this kind of deficit language. And it's interesting, language has sort of come up in your findings as well as in our discussions of what AP might look like going forward. And I was just wondering what your observations are on kind of how we might bridge some of those divides. I mean, there's a lot of kind of othering in different sectors and different factions, and how might, for example, mainstream practitioners thinking about, you know, your research then, and also some of the expertise and new studies that have been undertaken during COVID-19, what might mainstream practitioners take away from some of the practices that AP settings have developed in response to the challenges that they faced? And then the second part to that, apologies, it's fairly long, is, you know, do you think that this might have a longer term impact, or was this kind of transitory? And I appreciate that, you know, this might be sort of anecdotal, but I know that, you know, you've attended Westminster Insights and other, you know, interacted with other stakeholders, and I was just keen to get your thoughts and reflections on that. Thank you.
Can I just clarify the second part about whether the impact will be?
Do you think do you think their responses in terms of what practitioners have done? So, for example, you know, we had examples of hospital education practitioners using innovative technologies. You know, do you think those things are transitory or likely to have a, you know, actually,
Okay, yeah.
what opportunities might they have to have a longer term impact?
So I think, you know, I'm only one person, and I think actually, you know, I'd be interested to hear your and Fadur's perspectives on that second thing in particular, I suppose. But I do have some thoughts. I think for your first part of the question around what mainstream professionals in particular might take from this, I think it always strikes me that we focus. It's very easy, and in some of the government publications, when alternative provision is talked about, you know, in national discourse, very easy to say, you know, only 1% of pupils in AP settings get 5 GCSEs, A star C, or whatever the equivalent is now, and make quotes like that. And I think, and the outcomes they are poor for that setting. But actually, if you look at the numbers of students, there are a huge, like, because AP is a very small sector, there are always going to be more students in the local area that have attended mainstream schools who have a non-sustained destination than there are who have attended AP who have non-sustained destination, because the cohort is just dwarfs it. So I think there probably are things that mainstream practitioners could learn and maybe target at some of their students who they are perhaps more concerned about in terms of successful outcomes moving forwards. If mainstream schools had the capacity to track those students, it did seem to be, it wasn't necessarily staff going with students to support them as they transitioned into new settings. It was keeping tabs on students and understanding, actually having a full understanding of where they were going, which will probably interact with some level of like providing support and answering questions and making suggestions, but actually understanding where your students have gone to, those who are less likely to transition successfully, seem to be a real mark of what led to high levels of outcomes. In terms of your second question around what might the impacts of the pandemic be, I think the thing that struck me most is everyone knows how to do online education now. So I think I would almost view this as a real risk. I think there are real benefits to being in an educational setting with people, and I think it's a social experience. And it's not that you can't do that online, because obviously you can do a level of that online, but I think for the young people that are in my head when I talk about alternative provision settings, I think there's a big benefit being in an AP setting with adults who essentially care about you and provide a very supportive setting, and that allows you to grow and develop, and then hopefully become more independent and transition successfully. And I think, in my mind, I suppose there's a real risk, having learned how to do online education, that, you know, there's going to be a much smaller cost footprint for some of that, and actually students who are excluded for a period of time are likely to end up in alternative provision. They may be more likely now, post-pandemic, to be provided with an online education option, rather than an option where there are positive relationships that might be of real benefit in terms of future successful outcomes. So I think I see that's the key thing that I think I've thought about and reflected on in relation to what might change post-pandemic. Yeah, but I would be very interested to hear your thoughts as well.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to sort of just segue into one or two more questions that the audience asked in Slido. And there was one about targeting and whether the nature of the intake of the unit influences the outcomes. So if a provision targets young people for their interest in academic or vocational skills, whether you noticed there was any differences in that. And then in thinking about targeting and outcomes, which you've highlighted, there are a range of different outcomes for these young people. I wondered if you'd had any thoughts on the impact of transition funding at all, and obviously that that's going to be extended. What that might be, and yeah, just any thoughts on those kind of two areas.
Yeah, I think the key thing I would point to in terms of the findings of this study are make sure someone has the time, because often the mid and low performing settings, it was a sense of overwhelm, and like once we've got a new cohort in, we can't be trying to keep tabs on our previous students. That was the impression that came through a number of times actually in relation to tracking students, and actually there was that quite dramatic difference. 70% of upper quartile performance settings who responded to the FOI said that the data matched, like the probably quite robust data from the DFE matched what they thought in terms of where their students were at, and only 30% said that in terms of the lowest quartile. So I would really say spend some of that transition funding on making sure you're keeping track of your students and keeping in touch with them and understanding what their outcomes look like. I think that seemed, I would encourage alternative providers to do that and see, and then try and keep track of whether that seems to be making a difference or not. I think that would be a really important thing to do. And then the other two things, the two practices, because everything else is kind of like the culture of your organization. If you're an AP leader, the other two things seem to be something around, that academic offer, and then trying to supplement that academic offer with opportunities to kind of push the boundaries and take steps outside of the supportive environment that you create in AP into a college setting for a day week. Because one, like the kind of account that one of the high performing interviewees gave of that, like having a student still in alternative provision with them, but going to a college setting once a week was, well, if it doesn't go well one week, they're back here the next day and they know they're safe and they know it's okay. And then we can support them to go back again the next week until they get it right, until it goes right. And actually they build confidence being in that out of AP setting in an FE college perhaps. And then actually they maybe feel ready to transition to that FE setting. So opportunities to make mistakes, I suppose, in terms of taking measured steps outside of AP, but kind of supplementing whatever your offer is with those opportunities to take levels of independence outside of the AP setting, to push the boundaries a little bit from that kind of supportive setting, to loosen those AP constraints. I think that's where I would, from doing this research, encourage practitioners to spend that transition funding. So really tracking students effectively and then thinking about some of those opportunities for independence.
Great, thank you. I'll pass over to Fadua, who will finish going through the questions. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. We have another question, Andy, from Thomas Morris. Do you think that local leaders would equally consider the perspectives of staff from high-performing APs compared to staff from low-performing APs?
Well, so I think they should consider the perspectives of staff. I think there's probably local leaders aren't going to be aware, would be my instinct, of whether the AP setting is high performing or low performing, not in terms of the definition that I've used in terms of sustained destinations, because I don't think people necessarily tend to be that in touch with data like this and use it to inform their decisions about how they engage with people. I think there's a space, like I don't know if you've heard of systems leadership, but or systems thinking, like you don't have to be at the top of the hierarchy to lead, is kind of the principle that I remember from thinking about at some point. Like I think there's an opportunity for AP leaders and people in AP settings to lead in relation to issues that affect their students, and sometimes the door will be closed and people won't want to listen, but I think you can only try, I suppose. But I don't think that will be connected to whether the setting is high performing or low performing in terms of the specific outcomes that I was using for this research. And in fact, it seemed to be that staff being active and being aware of the local system, being engaged in kind of the system of AP more generally, seemed to be part of what made for a high performing AP setting in terms of these specific outcomes. I hope that helps. I would really encourage, you know, anyone working in AP to engage with the local system, because my instinct is the local system that kind of AP is part of in terms of pupils who are marginalised and excluded from mainstream settings. It's really important to coordinate around all of that stuff and do that really well, and that happens at a locality based level. So as an AP worker or leader, you have an opportunity to engage more broadly in that system. It might not be your direct remit, but I think engaging in that system strengthens that system and leads to better outcomes for not just your pupils, but anyone else, any other students probably in that kind of situation as well. That's I haven't got the research evidence to quite prove that, although there are a couple of things I could probably point at, but that is, yeah, why I think.
Right. So for the listeners, there's still time to put through your questions if you wanted to. I think there was another question from Victoria Bamsey. Thank you, Victoria. What are your thoughts on the SND Green Paper and the proposed changing of APs becoming part of maths, or even, yeah.
Yes. I think I don't like the push towards all APs becoming part of maths necessarily. If it's managed well and done in the right way, I don't think it would be necessarily detrimental. Like I say, I think local coordination of all of these settings in this whole area of the education system, because it's not just these settings, it's how they relate to mainstream schools, it's how you transition into post-16 settings, it's all kinds of things. I think that the local coordination of all of this is really important. So there's also stuff in the AP Green Paper, Send AP Green Paper, about local authorities having to coordinate with multi-academy trusts who are active in their area, and the possibility of local authorities setting up trusts as well and APs kind of converting to those. I think I generally view the role of alternative provision settings, particularly those larger settings which tend to be pupil referral units, AP free schools, AP academies, as being really important to this part of the education system on a local area basis, and actually therefore their connection to the local authority or their connection to those involved in the system that manages or is aware of these, like this part of the education system, and tries to make it work well, tries to build relationships and support students in these kind of contexts, is really important. So the idea that a pupil referral or an AP free school might convert or become part of a MAT that, you know, holds a number of APs across the country feels fragmentary. Like that, that's the massive thing that authors who've been around for a lot longer than me around the education system talk about what's happened over, you know, the last couple of decades, maybe slightly less than that, like massive fragmentation of the education system to a place where like it's just kind of, there's not that local coordination. And I think the Send AP Green Paper recognises the need for that local coordination, actually. So I think that's good. I think the only other thing I'd say is the Green Paper, on my reading, says both that AP settings will provide support into mainstream schoolings upstream, so students won't necessarily leave mainstream settings to have that supportive environment in AP, and also that schools will be responsible for that. And it seemed that they hadn't quite made up their mind in terms of where that expertise was going to come from. So I think that's an interesting tension to watch. Other than that, I have local experience from being on a management committee for an alternative provision setting, and actually the practice that we have in place locally is very much in line with what was set out in the Send Green Paper around AP in terms of, you know, having places for students who are going to transition to post-16 settings and they're going to be with us until then, having a reintegration approach, and then having services that go into schools as well. Like, it's those three core elements. Green Paper, I think, and that's reflective of the practice I see locally, but then, you know, I'm not aware of all the other settings. It will be very different AP practice in other localities.
Thank you. Andy, we don't have any new questions from our audience, but something that, building on what Amber said about post-pandemic and the findings that you mentioned, just very briefly, it seemed to me that one important finding, or which actually made quite sense, is that the role of the practitioners, AP practitioners, how they see themselves in their role, and how building rapport and to keep that communication line when they leave, to keep track of them, not necessarily keeping track, but even to keep that communication line going and to show an interest, and also the value of GCSE. And I know there's a lot of debate in alternative provision about whether GCSE is actually the right path for this cohort, and also the opportunity for them to increase their independence and to have other opportunities and to support them in that. How important do you think this is now? For example, this cohort this year, they've missed 2 years out, they've had online learning, and being an AP, how important do you think it is now? Do you think it is, has it changed? Is it more important? What is your reflection in a post-pandemic AP provision?
I think my instinct is it would have been different during the pandemic, because the world of post-16 education, or the world of post-16 work or training placements, would have been affected by the pandemic. But as things largely, in terms of practice and the way that an FE setting will be running and the provision that's available, seem to be reverting, I think all I can say really, I think based on the evidence I've collected, is that would be my encouragement to anyone working in AP, spending AP transition fund money, is keep track of your students. I think provide a high quality core academic offer. You say it's a debate in the sector, and I think I agree. It is something that people talk about, but it was something that came through really strongly, and I'm not necessarily expecting it. And I think it was something that I recognised from my time in AP as well. And then maybe using some of that funding as well to provide these opportunities to not just be at the AP kind of safe, secure setting, but also to shout into some of those other contexts where independence can be kind of explored, I suppose, before it's thrust by transition. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you to our audience for your great questions and engaging in this. I have one final request for my listeners. In our BRS SIG, we do like to provide opportunities for networking, collaboration, and also to hear, to provide a platform where practitioners and researchers can come together, work on potential blogs or podcasts for our SIG. If you have any ideas, please follow this QR and do type in the ideas you have for, if you would like to submit a blog or podcast for our SIG. I'm doing one next week on Lego and home education, and I don't know how it's going to go yet, but I'm quite looking forward to creating a podcast for BERA. Amber has one as well with a colleague, Joe Merritt. So yeah, it is very laid back. It's not highly academic. It can be just practice from your own experience. So please do. I can see someone is typing. Please do put through your ideas, or something you would like to, an event you would like us to facilitate, another event, some area you would like to us to
Thank
explore.
you for joining.
I think that is my sign that the time is up. Yes. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Andy, for your presentation and sharing with us. Thank you for our BERA admin team in the background. Thank you for your help today and your support. And I hope that we see you soon at another event.